Imagine waking up one morning, opening your laptop, and realizing that you are technically running Windows, but emotionally, practically, and philosophically, you are living in Linux. That strange feeling, that quiet realization that something fundamental has shifted, is exactly what Microsoft's so-called Linux mode represents. For decades, Windows and Linux were positioned as opposites, rivals locked in an endless war of desktops, servers, and ideology. Windows was the default, the familiar face on consumer PCs, while Linux was the outsider, the tool of developers, sysadmins, hackers, and enthusiasts who valued control over convenience. Now, Microsoft is blurring that line so aggressively that it's fair to ask whether Windows itself is becoming the most successful Linux distribution ever created, and whether that transformation could eventually make the Windows identity completely irrelevant. To understand why this moment is so dangerous for Windows as we know it, you have to rewind a bit. Microsoft's relationship with Linux used to be openly hostile. Executives once called Linux a cancer, a threat to intellectual property, a movement that undermined everything Microsoft stood for. Windows was the product, the platform, the ecosystem, and Microsoft's business depended on keeping users locked inside it. Linux represented freedom, open standards, and the terrifying idea that users might not need Microsoft at all. But slowly, quietly, that stance began to change. First, Linux showed up on Microsoft's servers. Then it dominated the cloud. Then Microsoft realized that almost everything powering the modern internet, from containers to supercomputers, ran on Linux. At that point, fighting Linux was no longer practical. Embracing it became a survival strategy. What we're seeing now with this new Linux mode is not just another feature or developer tool. It's the logical endpoint of a strategy that has been unfolding for years. Windows Subsystem for Linux started as a curiosity, a way for developers to run Linux command line tools without dual booting or spinning up virtual machines. At first it felt limited, experimental, almost harmless. But then WSL2 arrived, bringing a real Linux kernel into Windows. Suddenly, you weren't just emulating Linux behavior, you were running Linux itself. From there, graphical Linux apps appeared. GPU acceleration followed, system support arrived, and performance gaps narrowed. Each update made Windows less distinct and Linux more central to the Windows experience. Now imagine that evolution pushed to its natural extreme, a dedicated Linux mode where Windows can boot directly into a Linux environment. Manage Linux distributions as first-class citizens, integrate Linux package managers deeply into the system, and treat Windows AP as optional compatibility layers rather than the core of the OS. At that point, what exactly is Windows? Is it still an operating system? Or is it just a branded shell sitting on top of Linux, providing legacy support for older Windows applications while everything new and exciting happens in the Linux layer? This is where the existential threat begins. Windows' power has always come from its monopoly on the desktop and its massive ecosystem of applications built specifically for it. But that ecosystem is already eroding. More and more software is cross-platform by default. Web apps don't care what OS you're running. Developers target Linux first because that's where servers and containers live. Even gaming, once Windows' strongest fortress, is no longer a sure thing. Proton and Steam have proven that Windows games can run shockingly well on Linux. Native Linux ports are improving. GPU drivers are better than they've ever been. And with Vulkan replacing DirectX in many contexts, one of Windows' biggest advantages is slowly losing relevance. If Microsoft offers a polished Linux mode inside Windows, they solve a short-term problem while planting a long-term bomb under their own brand. In the short term, they keep developers happy. Developers get real Linux tools, real Linux environments, and real Linux workflows without leaving Windows. Companies don't have to retrain employees or rewrite policies. Everyone wins, at least on the surface. But over time, users start to notice something uncomfortable. They spend more time in Linux terminals than Windows settings. They manage software with apt-dnf or pacman instead of MSI installers. They customize Linux desktops, tweak .dot files, and rely on open-source tools. Windows becomes the thing you tolerate, not the thing you love. This is how platforms die, not with a dramatic collapse, but with a slow loss of relevance. If Linux mode becomes good enough, users will begin asking why they need Windows at all. If all their work happens in Linux environments, And if their critical applications either run natively on Linux or through compatibility layers, the Windows layer becomes optional. Once something is optional, it's already on borrowed time. There's also a philosophical shift happening here that Microsoft may not fully control. Linux is not just an operating system, it's a culture. It teaches users that they own their machines, that they can inspect, modify, and redistribute the software they use. Once people get a taste of that mindset, it's hard to put the genie back in the bottle. A developer who learns their workflow inside Linux mode might eventually install Linux directly on their laptop to get rid of the extra overhead. A power user who realizes they only boot Windows to access Linux might decide to remove Windows entirely. Microsoft can try to keep Linux fenced inside Windows, but history shows that once users are empowered, they don't like cages. Another critical angle is control and updates. One of the biggest complaints about Windows has always been forced updates, telemetry, ads, and decisions made without user consent. Linux, by contrast, offers choice. You decide when to update. You decide what runs on your system. You decide how much data leaves your machine. If Linux mode exposes more users to that level of control, it highlights everything that feels oppressive about Windows. Suddenly, Windows updates interrupting your workflow feel unnecessary. Telemetry feels invasive. The contrast becomes impossible to ignore. From a business perspective, Microsoft is also walking a tightrope. Windows licensing has been a massive revenue stream for decades. Even as cloud services and subscriptions grow, Windows remains a symbol of Microsoft's dominance. But Linux mode subtly shifts the value proposition. If Windows becomes primarily a compatibility and management layer for Linux, then the core value is no longer Windows itself, but Microsoft's services layered on top. Azure, Office, GitHub, and cloud integrations become the real products. In that world, the operating system is just a delivery mechanism. And if that's the case, there's nothing stopping those same services from running just as well, or even better, on pure Linux distributions. This is where the idea of Windows being killed starts to make sense. Not killed in the sense that it disappears overnight, but killed as an identity, as a default choice, as something people actively prefer. Think about how Internet Explorer died. Microsoft didn't kill it directly, they slowly stopped caring about it, shifted focus, and eventually replaced it with something else. Windows could face a similar fate, not replaced by another Microsoft OS, but dissolved into a hybrid that eventually tips fully toward Linux. There's also a generational factor. New developers are growing up with Linux as the norm. They learn programming in Linux environments. They deploy to Linux servers. They containerize everything. Windows, to them, is just another environment, not the center of the universe. If Microsoft's Linux mode becomes the gateway drug that introduces even more people to Linux, the long-term demographic shift accelerates. 10 years from now, the idea that Windows must exist as a separate, dominant desktop OS may feel outdated. Of course, Microsoft is not naive. They likely believe they can control this transition, that by owning the integration they can keep users within their ecosystem. But ecosystems are fragile when they rely on control rather than loyalty. Linux thrives precisely because no single company owns it. If Microsoft overreaches, the community can fork, adapt, and move on. Windows cannot do that. It lives or dies by Microsoft's decisions. There's a certain irony in all of this. Linux was once seen as the underdog that could never compete on the desktop. Now, it's so powerful and so ubiquitous that even Microsoft has to bend toward it. By introducing a Linux mode, Microsoft is effectively admitting that the future of computing belongs to Linux-like systems, and once that admission is made, it's hard to justify why Windows needs to remain a separate thing at all. Imagine a future where a new laptop ships with Windows, but the first run experience asks you which Linux distribution you want to use as your primary environment. Ubuntu, Fedora, Arch, Debian, or something custom curated by Microsoft. Windows quietly runs underneath, invisible, only there to support a handful of legacy applications. For most users, Windows might as well not exist. They would say they use Linux, even if technically they're still inside a Microsoft product. At that point, Windows is dead in all but name, and names matter. Brands matter. Once people stop identifying as Windows users and start identifying as Linux users, the psychological shift is complete. Software vendors follow users. Hardware manufacturers follow software vendors. The gravity moves. Microsoft can delay that moment, shape it, profit from it. But stopping it entirely may no longer be possible. So when people ask whether Microsoft's new Linux mode could finally kill Windows for good, the answer isn't a simple yes or no. It's more unsettling than that. Linux mode doesn't kill Windows by attacking it. It kills Windows by making it unnecessary, by teaching users that everything they care about can live comfortably in Linux, even inside a Windows shell. Microsoft is quietly training the next generation to outgrow Windows altogether. In the end, Windows may survive as a compatibility layer, a brand, a familiar logo on startup screens, but the soul of the system, the place where real work happens, will belong to Linux. And once that happens, Windows won't need a dramatic ending. It will simply fade into the background, a stepping stone that led the world to something freer, more open, and ultimately more powerful. That is why Linux mode isn't just another feature. It's a turning point, and it might be the moment when Windows, at long last, signs its own retirement papers without even realizing it.